Can I take a 15-minute walk at lunch? So if you've got a, an hour for lunch, can you take 15 minutes where you just get out of that noise of the office, where you get out of the sound of the fluorescent lights, the phones ringing, and maybe go to a park, or maybe it's just walk around the block. So think really, really small things. And when you've done that, and you've done that for 4, 5, 6 weeks, assess yourself. How do I feel with this? Do I enjoy doing it? Don't think about, did I lose weight? Do I fit into these jeans? Just think, how do I feel? Because one of the things that you think about, I like to say the good thing about social media is there's so much information. The bad thing about social media is there's so much information and not all of it's good.
Everybody, welcome to this week's edition of the Adapt You podcast. Super excited to have, and I'm blessed to have Ben Reuter, Ph.D., an exercise physiologist who teaches at a regional university. He is an active practitioner, a lifetime mover, and an athlete who's delved into the world of podcasting with 2 amazing podcasts. He believes that movement should be treated as a lifestyle, not just as an activity, because movement is a part of what makes life complete. A lot of us focus on just going out and kind of checking the box and going for that run, or maybe doing those sit-ups or those burpees and hitting the gym. But then we sit in our seats and we hardly move for the rest of the day. Ben's going to talk about as a exercise physiologist, the importance of movement as human beings as it relates to our overall health and well-being, both mentally and physically. So the idea for one of his podcasts, Moving to Live podcast, came from his interest in listening to long-form movement-related podcasts that were directed either towards professionals or the general public. Then his idea for the Fit Lab PGH podcast came during a run with his dogs when he realized that there were a variety of national fitness and movement-related podcasts, but none limited exclusively to Pittsburgh people, businesses, and activities. So as a Pittsburgh guy, he wanted to speak to his fellow Pittsburghians, I guess you'd call them. So Ben is he's a Ironman athlete, so holds a little special place in my heart. And as an exercise physiologist, he clearly has the knowledge and the understanding and the education to be able to speak to us about the importance of movement as human beings and how it can make a tremendous impact in our day-to-day lives. So that said, let's bring Ben onto the show. All right, everybody, I want to welcome to the show Dr. Ben Reuter. Ben, welcome to the show, man. Thanks so much for coming on.
Derek, thanks for having me come on. Always like to talk to people about movement and talk to people who are just excited about changing and realize that, life is a great thing.
Absolutely. I'm super stoked to specifically speak with you because you are an exercise physiologist, which to me is something that I have like a fascination with guys like yourself that know so much about exercise, so much about the science of exercise, the way it affects our body, the way movement affects our body, and the importance of it. But you guys get down to like the nitty gritty, the clinical level, which I'm a bit of a science geek and a nerd from that perspective. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So tell me a little bit about, explain to the audience, what is an exercise physiologist? Like, what do you do and how did you get into it?
Exercise physiologist is essentially, it's a, not really an umbrella term, but it could be anything from a clinical exercise physiologist where it's under a medical supervision. Think, for example, if you have a relative who's had a heart attack and they go to cardiac rehab, they're probably working with what would be defined as a clinical exercise physiologist or a cardiac exercise physiologist. To very often, if you are an athlete and you hire a coach, especially ones that are well-trained with experience, they may have a degree in exercise physiology. Basically, we look at the physiology or how the systems of the body work and the effects of exercise on those systems, whether it's beneficial, which we like to think it is, or there are instances where it cannot be beneficial. For example, I'm here in just south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's going to hit about 90 degrees. And I'm trying to convince myself that when I go out for my bike ride later this afternoon, going slow is better than going fast because the heat is going to have a stressor on my body in addition to the exercise.
That's phenomenal. And we were talking a little bit before the show. Ben's an Ironman athlete as well. So we're going to get into a little bit of that during our discussion. So I'm glad to see you're getting some miles on the bike today. How did you get into this line of work? Like, how did you end up here?
Well, I was fortunate enough to grow up in upstate New York in a relatively small school. So I was able to play three sports. I wasn't very good at them. I played soccer, basketball, and baseball. I went to Gettysburg College for my undergraduate, and I like to tell people, I was a 2-year junior varsity Division III soccer player, which for anybody who knows anything about college athletics, I wasn't very talented. But I was fortunate enough. I came into college. I knew I either wanted to be an athletic trainer or I wanted to be a marine biologist. I took a marine biology class and absolutely hated the plant aspect. So I got a undergraduate degree in physical education. I got a master's degree in athletic training, and I had some really great mentors. There's a gentleman who has since passed on, one of the fathers of sports nutrition, Dr. Mel Williams, and I was fortunate enough to have him for 2 classes in graduate school. Absolutely phenomenal professor. And he said, you ought to think about getting a doctorate. And, as somebody who's done marathons and Ironman distance triathlons, you're always looking for, can I do it? Okay, I've done a marathon. Can I do an Ironman? Maybe you're saying, can I do a 50K instead of a marathon? And for me, that was kind of partially the reason I pursued a doctorate in exercise physiology, kind of because as an athletic trainer, my first year out of grad school, I worked 48 out of 52 weekends in addition to the regular job. And I really wasn't excited about it. It was kind of same old, same old. I could have gone into administration and I didn't really want to do that. So it's like, well, what's better to do when you don't know what to do is go back to school. And an interesting sideline of that, I was working for a very good orthopedic surgeon as an athletic trainer in Atlanta, Georgia. He wanted me to go to physician's assistant school, come back and work for him as a physician's assistant. And I was totally convinced that that's what I was going to do. I went to the Southeastern American College of Sports Medicine meeting in Lexington, Kentucky to visit with some friends. And this is a story, you never know who's going to hear this. And if they hear this, I had been a subject in a study at Georgia State University, running on a treadmill and looking at the effects of carbohydrate drinks. And there was a graduate student there. I don't remember her name. She had been a hurdler at North Carolina State. And when you're running on the treadmill for upwards of 20 miles, there's a lot of time for conversation. And I'd mentioned, I'm going to go to school to be a physician's assistant because I really don't want to be I'm just don't know if exercise physiology is where I should go. People had told me you don't want to be an exercise physiologist. You've got enough education. And I was at Southeastern ACSM, and I saw this girl, and she grabbed my arm and said, "You need to come talk to my professor." And literally with a 5-minute conversation, I drove back to Atlanta from Lexington. It's like, okay, I'm going to grad school for exercise physiology. So the professor was Dr. Ben Johnson, who is a biomechanist. I believe he's at the University of Kentucky. If he happens to listen to this or anybody does, I owe him a debt of gratitude. I also know Dr. Andy Doyle, who was the professor who was the lead author of the study that I was the subject in. He had some positive feedback on this. And you never realize as a professional just what the comments are or what you say to somebody. And both of those two gentlemen are probably the reason, in large part, why I'm sitting here rather than in a doctor's office working as a physician's assistant.
It's amazing. Just the small conversations and just the fact that gal grabbed your arm and it literally changed the trajectory of your life and put you in a different seat. And it's wild to think that. So you're right. We all need to be mindful of the words. It is.
And I've actually hunted down about 6 months ago. I finally sent a thank you letter to Dr. Doyle and said, "Do you remember who this graduate student was?" Because I wanted to thank her. And unfortunately, it was a master's student. He didn't remember her. So if anybody out there is listening, I know she was a hurdler at North Carolina State, got a master's degree at Georgia State. This lady had a great deal of impact on my life just from saying, "Hey, you need to talk to my professor."
That's wild. That's crazy. So you mentioned in there that you're from upstate New York. Whereabouts in upstate New York are you from?
I grew up basically from the time we moved around a little bit, but from the time I was in second grade until I was a senior in college when my parents moved, about 20 miles from Cooperstown. So anybody who's
Wow.
a baseball fan, I was
Mhm.
about 20 miles from Cooperstown, about 20 miles from Oneonta, and about 20 miles from Cobleskill. So small rural community, which had the great opportunity of allowing me to play at being an athlete in all three sports. And I think it's probably has a significant reason why I'm in the movement field, because I remember I grew up on a dairy farm, and when I entered high school, my dad said, well, you can play one sport, but I need your help for the rest of the year. So I said, well, I'll play soccer, because it was the first sport. I'm 14 years old. It's like, I want to play in the fall. And
Yep.
about halfway through the season, he goes, it's a small school. You should really support all the sports. You should play basketball too. And then about halfway through the basketball season, the same thing in baseball. So I know with the specialty of sports today, and how difficult or how competitive they can be, I had the opportunity to get a wide variety of movement experiences. And the interesting thing is, back then, if you told me that I would enjoy running, and I mean, obviously I rode a bike, but I hated the running portions of soccer. I didn't like the distance running. And now I'm sure, like go out in the woods or go on a trail and just go for a 2-hour run, not even thinking about pace, is just one of the best things to do psychologically for me.
Same. Some of my best creative thoughts, ideas come from those long journeys deep into the woods, those long bike rides. Your mind just runs. That's what I love about the sport and activity. So let's dive into movement. So you're well known. You have a podcast as well. Can you tell everybody about your podcast briefly before we get into the movement side of things?
Sure. We've got two podcasts, and actually this is how the movement idea came. It's the idea for the podcasts, like you probably, I'm a longtime podcast listener. I remember back in 2007 or 2008 when there were the Dirtbag Diaries on iTunes. And the
Mm-hmm.
ability to actually hear stories and do things like, I don't have to pay for this, was cool. I've actually done a podcast for one of my professional journals, the Journal of the Strength and Conditioning Journal, which is part of the National Strength and Conditioning Association, since 2010. But it was always like, just ask 2 or 3 questions and get out, because I was nervous. And I was out running with my dogs, 2015, 2016, and listening to a podcast, and heard a very well-known biomechanist, Dr. Stuart McGill, say, and I'm paraphrasing, some of the people doing the best things in this field you never hear about, because they don't worry about their social media. They worry about what they do. And I was stupid enough, curious enough, I won't say brave enough, but it's like, I went home and I researched and I found out what Tim Ferriss used for his podcast. And I figured, a couple million downloads. If it's good for him, it's good for me.
Yep.
Ordered a whole bunch of equipment, sat it on my kitchen table, and realized I don't know how to use this stuff. So to cut the story short, Pittsburgh is not necessarily an active city. It has pockets of activity. And before I started contacting people all over the world, it's like, I'll talk to people who do movement in Pittsburgh. So we started FitLab PGH, or Fitness Lab Pittsburgh. I do this with my girlfriend, where we just talk to people in the Pittsburgh area who are either in the movement field or have a really neat movement story. Just as a quick example, we interviewed a guy who was an organizer for a hike in memory of his family member who had committed suicide. But to hear him tell the story about how for 40 some years he commuted to work either walking or biking because he enjoyed it. And the other thing we do with that podcast is 3 times a week, we do 1-minute movement tip lifestyle hack videos, just little simple things, just to promote the ethos. Movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity. My second podcast that we do is called Moving to Live, and I interview other professionals or people with really interesting stories where movement is a priority. So for professionals, I've interviewed sleep researchers, I've interviewed exercise scientists to find out A, what they do, and B, their story. Because you may think, wow, you see somebody doing something, I want to do what they do. You don't realize the journey to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes them much more approachable if you can say, oh, I see why they're saying this, because I understand what their background is.
That's awesome. And it's so refreshing to talk to a fellow podcaster because we were saying before, you've got the equipment, you've got the voice, you know how to carry on a great conversation. So I'm anxious to check out your podcast as somebody that is a firm believer in movement. I have to give it a listen. And I encourage those. We'll put the information on both podcasts in the show notes, and we're going to discuss, give you another plug here at the end of the podcast as it relates to yours. So let's dive into it. Let's get into movement. Talk to me about movement and why it's so important, and what the importance you see in it.
Sure. As I mentioned, I mean, my background was I was active. I took it for granted. And as we were talking before reporting the podcast, I've got an eye that's very nearsighted. In about 2014, I finally, after people told me or physicians told me for years, because of the nearsightedness, you're going to have a detached retina. It happened. And when they tell you there's a black cloud that goes across one side of your vision, it's like, yep, they're exactly right. You can look up the picture on Google, and that's exactly what it looked like. And at the time, I thought, oh, well, okay, it happened. It's over. But unfortunately, over the next 3 years, there were 9 surgeries and 15 different procedures because the retina kept detaching in different places. It was not the surgeon's fault. The surgeon was and is phenomenal. It basically turned into a physics problem. The good eye was 25 millimeters front to back as far as length. The bad eye, or the nearsighted eye, was 30 millimeters front to back. Same amount of retinal material covered the inside of both of them. So if you have a certain amount of material to cover a small balloon and a certain amount of material to cover a large balloon, the material covering the large balloon is more likely to tear because it's going to be stretched thinner. And that's essentially what happened. And I'm knocking on wood if this is video, knocking on my head. Last procedure was in 2017. I still see the doctor periodically just to make sure everything's okay. But in the course of that, there were times when I couldn't move because part of the recovery of the treatment for detached retina is they'll put an air bubble in your eye to push against the retina, and you have to hold a certain position for 20 plus hours a day. So I couldn't move. Or at other times,
what's that position you had to hold?
In my case, the position, it really depends on where the tear is. In my case, the position was either face down or lying on my stomach with my head turned to the left.
And how long did you have to do? 20 hours a day, but for how many days in succession?
It depended. It basically was how long does the air bubble last? Sometimes as long as, I think the longest was about 12 days.
Oh, God.
And the interesting thing is even more, which I learned is, there was probably an 18-month period where I had to either sleep on my side or sleep on my stomach. I wasn't allowed to sleep on my back or my left side. And I'll confess, and I'm not telling any secrets because I told my physician, I would last until 4 a.m. And it's like, okay, the last 2 hours, I'm going to sleep in a comfortable position.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. And also we change positions in the middle of the night when we don't even realize it. I've got a little bit of a bum left shoulder, and I'll wake up because it hurts. And I'm like, oh, I rolled over on this side. So that recovery, those surgeries, was the surgery with an attempt to reattach everything? Is that
Yeah,
what the surgery was doing?
I have very limited vision in that eye, 2400 minus, but it's good for basically seeing things coming to the side or seeing images. So we wanted to save as much as possible. And what they were surgeries that were essentially lasers, where they would laser the retina down. There were a couple of surgeries where they would put silicone in the eye instead of the air bubble for a longer lasting thing. Because of the multiple surgeries, there was some glaucoma, secondary glaucoma was developed. So it was a wide variety, but the majority of them were for to try to repair, or not to try to successfully repair the tears that were occurring because the material was very thin.
So during this time when you had to remain still, and laying in like an odd, peculiar position, and this happened multiple times. I think you said 8 or 9 of these surgeries. What was that? What was that like? I mean, obviously you talk of a story of running 20 miles on a treadmill while you're, in college, right? So it's obviously sport is something that's been in your life, and endurance is something in your life. For those who are listening that are active and fit currently, I think you can relate to the fact that it's like torture when you can't move.
It was. I mean, one of the things I would do, I would schedule my breaks out of that position to take my dogs for walks, and that was a good thing. Um, and it really, even as I recovered, I basically recovered, and then in 2017 I herniated a disc in my back. Um, Recovered from that and just was achy, and saw, basically because of the podcast I had, there was a chiropractor athletic trainer here in the Pittsburgh area, Dr. Pete Thomas. And Pete gave me some great exercises, and he probably gave me the most valuable piece of information anybody gave me. He looked at me and he goes, "You're trying to train like it was 2013 or 2014. It's 2017, and you had 3 years or 4 years where you were not able to train. Back it off." And I mean, I remember walking out of his office and going, I'm a dumb fill in your favorite expletive, because that's the same sort of thing that I would give to a client or a patient when I was working as an athletic trainer. It's like, oh, gee, yeah, I'm a dummy. And
so you're still working out like you're in like Iron Man shape, but you're not, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
It's like, well, I don't understand why I can't go out and run 6 miles. Well, I hadn't done that. Or I can't understand why I can't go out and spend 4 hours on the bike, and the next day I can't walk.
It's humbling, right? Isn't it humbling?
It was humbling. And along those same lines, so is holding that sedentary position, or having times where, for me, it was sedentary because, it was a 20-minute walk or a 30-minute walk. At that same period of time, one of my Labrador retrievers, who unfortunately has since died, developed idiopathic epilepsy. And so she had a neurologist, and I remember talking to the neurologist, and I said to the neurologist, what can I do with her? Because these were grand mal seizures. And she said, you can do whatever you want. And I knew, like me, I don't know if I found her or she found me, or just the dogs. She and all of my dogs I've ever had, they love to go in the woods. So we do fartlek training. And for your listeners who don't understand what fartlek training is, it's basically speed play. So speed play would be, you basically go at a variety of paces, like you see a tree and you run for it, or you jog at different speeds. So it's just different speeds of movement. In our case, or in my case, when I go with my dogs, it's whatever they want to do. If they want a sniffy walk, we sniff. If they want to go for a run, we run. And after about 3 months, she goes for her follow-up, and the vet says, I don't know what you're doing with this dog, but keep doing it, because her heart rate's low, she's calm, and she looks better than any other dog that I have as a patient who has epilepsy. So we were able to keep her alive for 4 years. By the time she died, she was on 8 different medications for the epilepsy. But one of the great things that it made me realize is, not just for me, but for her, movement is a lifestyle. I mean, it got me really into recognizing that not necessarily working out, but moving, whether it was a walk, whether it was doing some sort of resistance training, whether it was gardening, that had a huge impact, not only on my mental health, but also on my animal's mental health. She was calmer. She came out of seizures faster. And it kind of reminded me, before I started my doctoral program, a mentor of mine told my major professor, he said, if Ben's ever a jerk to deal with, send him out for a run or send him out for a bike, and he'll be a lot easier to deal with. And I think what I realized over the course of the eye surgeries for me, and dealing with an epileptic dog, and especially came in with the past year plus with COVID, is 45 to 90 minutes of movement, not exercise. 45 to 90 minutes of movement for me, at least 5 or 6 days a week, is essential. It's obviously gives me a pretty good base for physical activity if I want to go out on that 4-hour ride. But psychologically, mentally, as you mentioned, I was nodding along. You said, that's where my ideas come from. That's where problems that you think, God, I don't know what I'm going to do. It's like, oh, well, I should do this. It's for lack of a better term, moving rhythmically, whether it's doing yard work. I've got 4 acres, so there's always work to do, whether it's hiking, whether it's running. It's therapeutic, and it's calming. And it's the perfect thing. Somebody once said, well, what's your perfect day? And I would admit I am probably a little bit more excessive than some of your listeners and a little bit less excessive. So a good day for me is 60 to 90 minutes with my dogs in the woods, doing whatever they want to do. Come back, have a snack, 3 or 4 hour bike ride, preferably a gravel bike ride or in the woods, hopefully with one or two other people, because just like those good ideas, um, you can have some great conversations when you're walking, when you're running, when you're doing that. And it's just made me realize kind of the trio of the coming together, the eye surgeries, the starting of the podcast, because I wanted to learn other people's stories, the situation with the dog, movement is a lifestyle. It's not just an activity, because movement is part of what makes our life complete. And the big emphasis is, look, movement is important. Workouts are important. Doing that 3 to 5 times a week of aerobic training, doing that resistance training is important. But so many people don't do that. Let's go back and meet them where they are. Let's talk about movement and make movement the norm rather than the abnorm.
And I love that, because I think a lot of time, words are powerful, right? When you talk about movement being a lifestyle versus an activity, right? I think people can start to have a longer term relationship with movement, right? And they can view it in a different view than they would. I think people who don't enjoy exercise, they put that label of exercise and they see it as a chore. They see it as something that they procrastinate on. They see it something that they just don't want to do. But when you are able to sort of change the label, right, and define it as movement, and movement can be, like you said, gardening, walking a dog. It doesn't need to be some sort of HIIT training, right? That's you're sitting there with your daily burn app that maybe you're doing it only because you pay the $14.99 a month, right? Or you have to go to the gym and get in the car and drive there. There's a difference. So I think it's real important for people to understand what Ben is saying is that there's definitely a difference between sort of movement and exercise, but it sounds like, the incorporation of both are important, right? So
Absolutely. We don't want to pick on any specific app or any specific business, but that's the big thing. High intensity interval training, 30 minutes in and out the door or whatever. And one of the things you have to think about is, yes, that can be very good. That can be excellent, depending on the facility, the building of communities. People say, hey, Derek, where were you? We missed you. Or Derek, that was a great job today. But at the same time, let's look at our whole overall life as far as what we do. And if you're going for that, let's be generous, 5 days a week, 50 minutes a session, what do you do the rest of the time? You're still, if that's your workout or that's your movement for the week, you are essentially a sedentary person. So we're always looking to improve. I mean, I know your podcast is about change and adapting. We're always looking to improve. So, but if we're saying, well, I don't need to do anything because, I go to the gym 5 days a week, it's like, well, that's great. But there are so many benefits that you touched upon, curiosity, intellectual things, stress relief, great conversations by doing lower intensity stuff. If you've got kids, if you're fortunate enough or unfortunate enough, depending, to have teenagers or preteens where they get to that point where they don't want to talk to mom or dad, it's a lot easier to talk to mom or dad if you're out for a walk. What you do has a direct impact on what your kids and what your friends' kids do. I know I've got a lady that I interviewed here in Pittsburgh who was a former junk food person, smoker, etc. And her daughter wanted to do a run to raise money for a children's hospital. And her husband and her, to support her, started doing things, and now she has their entire family. The activity has changed. The kids ask the parents, when can we do a 5K run, or when can we go do this hike? And if you spend time with friends, if you spend time with family, how do you spend it? I mean, there's obviously many of us have fond memories, or maybe continue to do it, of you meet friends for drinks or you meet friends for dinner. But I've also got great memories and great experience of meeting friends for not a workout, but for a run or a bike or a walk. Two scenarios for that. I was speaking at a conference a few years ago, and a friend of mine from when I was getting my doctorate degree, happened to be stationed at the Pentagon. He was career military. And the conference was in Washington, D.C. And Sam and I had texted. We hadn't seen each other in probably 15 years. And he's like, hey, I'm running at such and such a place at 5:30 in the morning. You want to meet? It's like, absolutely. I don't remember how fast we ran. I don't remember exactly where we ran, but I remember the conversations were just like we'd had 15 years ago when we used to meet every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I've got a friend of mine from college. She meets a girlfriend of hers every morning at 5:30 in the morning, and they walk 3 to 5 miles. Yes, there is the workout component or the getting the motion, but that's the time she's away from her husband. She's away from her kids. It's girl time.
Yep.
And that's so much healthier. Even if it's just strolling, that's so much healthier than saying, hey, let's meet for a glass of wine. You can stroll and then go for a glass of wine. I don't want to say you have to go hardcore exercise, 365 days a year, but be conscious of what your behaviors are, and not only what is the influence on them now, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I'm thinking, if you get to the end of the year and you've scheduled activity or movement and you've achieved 70 to 80% of those scheduled times, you've done really, really well. And if you look back over the course of the year, you've got a volume of movement that obviously has the benefits of the immediate time, but also is building on as far as adaptations or equipping your body to do things in times of stress. One of the things that we know, I mean, you can't have a podcast or conversation about wellness at this time without at least touching on COVID. One of the things we know from the statistics and what's come out is, people who have had more severe symptoms or side effects, if they've been unfortunate enough to catch the virus, and I'm not saying this movement prevents this, but people have a tendency who are more sedentary, people who have chronic lung problems, people who are carrying excessive body weight. And I'm not saying movement will cure all these things, but what we have to look about is everything that we do in life stresses our bodies. There's good stress or eustress, there's bad stress or distress. And if you think back to when you were in college or when you were in high school, think about the times when you were most likely to pick up that cold or the flu. Around the end of the semester, papers are due, finals are due, you've got the stress of maybe you're going home to mom or dad and you've been living on your own. So what happens is your body is able to, just throughout life, and this is very simplified, deals with stress. You walk out of your podcast studio and somebody yells at you or somebody runs into your car. That's a stress. You go for a run. That's a stress. So what we have to do, or what we learn to do, is to adapt or to deal with that stress or respond to that specific adaptation to impose demand. Hans Selye. Some of those ways that we respond to stress can be bad. Maybe we respond by lashing out at a boyfriend or girlfriend or a spouse or our kids. Maybe we drink too much. Maybe we use illegal drugs. Maybe we have too much food. Think about learning what things are stressors for you, both good and bad, and think about, how do I manage those? Are there some things that I can eliminate? Like, one of the things that I've come up with is I've recognized there are certain people who are just energy vampires. And I can't take that phrase. I'm using that phrase from somebody I interviewed on the podcast. And you can think about this. There are some people that you finish talking to them and you're excited, you're eager, you're happy. It's like they make you feel good. They build you up, or they just make you feel excited. And there's other people, when you finish, I mean, it's like, God, that really sucked. Those are the energy vampires. Sometimes you can't avoid those people. Sometimes you're forced to because that's your boss or your coworker. But other times you can't. And those energy vampires, those are, the things that cause you stress. Think about what they are. Think about how movement can help alleviate that. Like, if I have to talk to one of those energy vampires, I'm going to be more likely to try to do it on a phone call where I can walk, so I can burn off some of that stress or burn off or manage it. So it's, I've kind of rambled on a little bit. I'm sure I've opened it up for some questions, but we need to use movement for an improvement of a quality of life.
Yeah, I think especially during COVID, people have definitely been a lot more sedentary in their lifestyle. But pre-COVID, you're right. You made a reference and a point earlier about individuals that go to the gym for that 30 to 45 minutes, 5 days a week. But other than that, they sit on the couch, they sit in a chair, and they don't move, right? So what I like about your approach and your podcast and all that you speak about is is really those are almost two different things. They can be the same thing, but they're also two different things. So in the idea that while exercise is a great way to, and we can get into some of the physiological benefits and from the science perspective, what actually happens when you start to move, what actually happens when you exercise and the hormones that are released into the bloodstream and how it makes us feel. But the reality is that it's to your point, it's a great way to de-stress. It's another outlet. So rather than drinking, kicking the dog or whatever it is that you use to get your stress out, movement's a great way, and it brings balance, back into your life. So I want to talk, first question, because you brought up so many good points there. I'd love to talk for a bit about, and whether you want to frame it under the notion of movement or you want to frame it under the notion of exercise or both. As an exercise physiologist, can you talk about what's actually happening in the body, right? Why is it that it is helping us de-stress? What are the physiological things that are occurring during that process of movement that, from a science geek perspective, hit me with what's going on there and why we should do it?
Sure. So dropping down a little bit the rabbit hole, we want to talk about first homeostasis. Homeostasis is basically your body is able to withstand stresses, and I'm simplifying this. This is the way you want to be, excuse me, at rest. So if you're sitting there quietly in a temperate room or standing there, heart rate's at your normal resting rate. There's no stress because somebody's yelling at you or there's a lot of noise in the background, or bright lights flashing. Think of that as homeostasis. At the opposite end of the spectrum, think about you're in your car, you're in rush hour, and somebody runs into you in the back. You're not seriously hurt, but your heart rate's up, you're breathing more, you've activated your sympathetic nervous system even more. And anytime we stress our bodies, our sympathetic nervous systems are stressed or activated to a greater extent than they are at rest. That's a good thing. Although, as you mentioned, if you do only high intensity interval training, you do too much of that, it can be a bad thing. So what we like to do for a significant portion of their exercise, and when we talk about movement as a lifestyle, this is what we're talking about most of it. We want to exercise at a level that's steady state. So steady state, for non-exercise geeks, it's basically, think of it as the level of the intensity of exercise. If we said, hey, Derek, you got to do this for the next 30 minutes to 2+ hours. Now, if you're going to go more than about 90 minutes, we'll give you a little bit of food, we'll give you some fluids, etc. So when you think about steady state exercise, you think about walking, you think about when you were training for your Ironman, those long, slow distance runs, those easy bike rides. If you're a paddler, the easy stand-up paddleboarding where you're just recreationally paddling around. Those are steady state. So your body is stressed more, but your body's able to respond easily to those stresses. You can continue on that for quite a long time. The benefits of these are a couple of things. First of all, your body learns how to utilize different nutrients. It learns how to better utilize fats. It learns how to use a little bit, if it's prolonged, protein, and it learns, or it continues to use carbohydrates as a fuel. Second thing that this does is it trains the heart. So your heart becomes more efficient at beating. And this, again, is not a single exercise bout. Think of this as if you say, I'm going to do this for the next 4 to 6 weeks. So it's an adaptation over long term. So your heart rate can slow. So somebody who is not a mover, somebody is saying, boy, I know I need to do something, they may have a resting heart rate when they get up in the morning of 70 beats per minute, pre-coffee. You, as somebody who's better trained, depending on who you are, genetics are going to have a component in it. You may have a resting heart rate in the low 50s. Mm-hmm. Same thing that will happen with the training is your heart will become more powerful. So it will pump more blood per beat. So at a given workload, think a given exercise intensity, your heart doesn't have to work as hard. So it's more efficient. It's easier. Your body develops more capillaries in the muscles. The muscles learn to function. Mentally, there are hormones that are released that can have a calming effect. Mm-hmm. Now, at a little more extreme, because some people like to do that higher intensity stuff, think of it as you're kind of tweaking the system. You're going above steady state. You're stressing your body and allowing it to recover. You can still have all of these adaptations, but it's one of those things, if you do too much, you've stressed your body too much, and it's either too hard to recover. So maybe you notice the next morning your heart rate is elevated. Maybe you notice you lose that urge to exercise, or you look forward to that day off. There are all kinds of wearables and tools that are out there. But if you talk to long-term running coaches, or to go into the animal world, horse trainers, they can just look at the athlete, and I'm calling the horse an athlete, or the runner, and maybe just ask a question. Hey, Derek, how do you feel today? And just by the way you respond, say, take the day off. So there's an art and a science behind that. But the benefits of exercise are, some of them are what I said, remembering that too much can negate those positive effects, or depending on what else is going on in your life. So if you're working 80 hours a week because of your podcast and your other job, probably not the best time to say, hey, I want to train for this Ironman coming up in October, because that's an additional stress. Mm-hmm. If you're getting married, if you're in a new relationship, everything all incorporates it. And one of the things we found is, movement absolutely is important, but incorporate movement into other aspects of your life and recognize when more movement is possible or a good thing, and when maybe it can have a negative effect. It took me 20 plus years to figure out that 45 to 90 minutes is kind of my sweet spot for movement, even if it's low intensity. It took me probably 20 years to realize that when I go to professional conferences where I'm on my feet and going around all day, my goal is to get about half my normal movement in. If I can get 20 to 30 minutes of movement in a day, that's a benefit. If I try to get that 45 to 90 minutes, I'm going to be giving up on sleep, because let's be honest, I'm probably up later. I'm going to be more stressed, because I know this will be hard for you to believe, but I'm essentially an introvert. So being on all the time and having people know me and having to talk to them and have to do that. So I recognize, okay, going to these conferences, I need to back off my movement. Doesn't mean it's like, I'm just going to go and eat whatever I want, stay up all night. It means I'm still going to get up. You're still going to see me at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning doing something, or maybe doing a suspension trainer workout in my hotel room. But I'm going to recognize that it's not going to be that same sort of movement, because all of these other things in my life are giving me stressors. And if I try to do that, pretty much guaranteed when I get back within a week or so, I'm going to be sick.
It's funny. You're right. I think we all have to, and this is a learned thing, and it adjusts with age. I think a little bit, but generally speaking, I think, especially for athletes like yourself, you're very in tune with, how much you have in your cup, right? I don't know what I want to call what's in that cup, but you only have so much energy throughout the day. And that you can put more in that cup with movement, right? Or I can take a lot out of that cup with too much movement, or too much high intensity movement, or stress, or someone hits my car, or all the references that you made. So, but we all have that sweet spot, and you found yours. And I think it's important for people to understand how to find theirs. So that brings me to the next question. Help people. So you sort of define the difference between movement and exercise, and the importance and the physiological benefits to both, right? And what they can do both for us mentally and physically. For those who maybe aren't exercising as much as they should, or moreover aren't having the movement, right? What are some tips and tricks that they can implement into their life? And maybe even, I don't know if you're a believer in wearables for setting goals of standing movement and steps and things like that, but people need those hacks. They need those things to hold them accountable. What suggestions would you make for those who are listening that need to incorporate some more movement in their lives and find their sweet spot, like you found yours?
Well, I'll answer or touch on the second part first. Yes, I am a wearables fanatic / tech geek. I've used the Aura Ring for probably the past 3 years, ever since the version 2 is available. I also take my HRV every morning with a different device. And the key thing to remember with wearables is they're tools. If you look at the wearable value and say, oh, well, my heart rate's up, I shouldn't do anything, or, oh, my sleep quality. What it does is it reinforces. Like, one of the things that the wearable has identified for me, I am in no ways what would be classified as a heavy drinker. A heavy drinking night for me at a conference would be 3 glasses of wine or 3 beers.
Okay.
And I'm gonna feel it the next day.
Mm-hmm.
But I have noticed, and actually with one of my personal training clients who's an electrical engineer who's dropped down the rabbit hole of wearables too, 6 ounces of wine. I can have 6 ounces of wine before 6 p.m. and enjoy 6 ounces of wine. If I have that second glass of wine, if it's before 6 a.m. or 6 p.m., sorry, not 6 a.m., it's going to have an effect on my sleep. So I have to make a conscious choice. Same thing is if I have that wine after 7 o'clock, even if it's 1 glass of wine, my sleep quality is going to be affected. So there may be times where I'm out, I'm socializing, I'm having a good time, and I'm making the conscious choice. Okay, I know this is going to affect my sleep. I know I'm not going to have as good sleep. I know I'm going to be slightly off tomorrow, or off is a bad word, but things are not going to be as they normally are. But the positives are going to outweigh the negatives, interacting with friends, etc. On the other hand, if I know, boy, I've got a bike ride scheduled tomorrow and it's important to me, or I've got an important presentation, or, I'm going to go do this or that, then I can make the choice on that too. So the wearables are tools. I also know from the wearables that if I use my iPad or my phone or my computer late at night, it's going to affect my sleep. If I use a Kindle Paperwhite, it doesn't affect my sleep. And I'm somebody, I used to say, oh yeah, I can see how that's going to affect other people. Has no effect on me. Until I try it, it's like, oh, I'm not special. It does affect me. So wearables, yes. But how do people get started? It depends on what you are. Some people, I can tell from talking to you, you're a self-motivator. You're going to drop down the rabbit hole and probably read too much and have somebody drag you out and say, no, just simplify it and do this. So there are those people. Like I've got a client I work with for probably 8 or 9 years. I've got friends of mine. Well, they'll use me as a sounding board. Hey, I'm thinking of doing this. What do you think? So I think one of the things is, if you're one of those people who drops down the rabbit hole, you'd like to be a self-learner, have a sounding board, somebody who isn't emotionally involved. How often have you, for example, you're training for an Ironman and, well, I don't see any reason why I can't ride 100 miles on Saturday, 100 miles on Sunday, and turn around and run for 3 hours on Monday. It's written in my program. It sounds good. I've seen somebody do it. But somebody who's looking at it and looking at your training volume and looking at everything that's going on is going to say, Derek, maybe you're better off riding 75 miles, an easy day the next day, and then run your 3 hours. The advantage of that is you've got somebody who isn't emotionally vested and maybe thinking you're better than you are, or not recognizing the stressors. So if you're one of those people, have a sounding board or 2 sounding boards. And most of us probably have 4 or 5 people that we can call up in different fields or different ideas and say, what do you think of this? If you're not one of those people, if you're starting from ground zero, you're not sure. Obviously, the first thing is make sure you've got clearance from a medical professional that you don't have pre-existing conditions. Second thing is, it's not a bad idea. Ask friends. Hey, who do you know who's a good source of information? And I am a big fan for people who are starting out of having them use a personal trainer, not 3 times a week, come into the gym, et cetera, but somebody who will sit down and talk to them, give them some sort of a program, even if it's a walking program. So, if your boyfriend or girlfriend or somebody, God, I want to do this. What do I do? You buy them a session with a good personal trainer who understands what their goal is. And then maybe it's 5 sessions or 3 sessions. They go off, they do their thing. Then they do follow-ups. So I think the first thing is to start really, really slow, and don't say, well, I'm going to exercise or I'm going to move an hour every day or 45 minutes to 90, because I heard this guy on Derek's podcast and that's what he did. This was years and years of planning and adapting and pushing and changing things in my life so I could do that. But if you're doing nothing, say, what can I do realistically? Can I take a 15-minute walk at lunch? So if you've got an hour for lunch, can you take 15 minutes where you just get out of that noise of the office, where you get out of the sound of the fluorescent lights, the phones ringing, and maybe go to a park, or maybe it's just walk around the block? So think really, really small things. And when you've done that, and you've done that for 4, 5, 6 weeks, assess yourself. How do I feel with this? Do I enjoy doing it? Don't think about Did I lose weight? Do I fit into these jeans? Just think, how do I feel? Because one of the things that you think about, I like to say the good thing about social media is there's so much information. The bad thing about social media is there's so much information and not all of it's good. So some of these pictures and these things that you see of people on social media, especially Instagram, they're not necessarily healthy. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but the image visually isn't going to be. So for example, and everybody's slightly different. The second thing I can recommend along those lines with, either sounding board or hiring a professional to kind of be their sounding board until you develop those relationships with people who can do this. And there'll be a third one too. Find a good registered dietitian. Just for a session, just to talk to them about what you eat. Find out how is my diet where it is out? What can I tweak? It doesn't mean, oh my God, I'm going to eliminate this or I'm going to eliminate that. Just get an idea, somebody who knows more than you. And, realistically, if you pick up one tip, if you recognize, oh, well, yeah, I do feel worse when I have two sugar packets with my Starbucks coffee in the morning. You could maybe make those changes. And then the third thing that I would recognize is look at yourself, look what you do outside of the movement, outside of the activity. I mean, one of the big things that is starting to get awareness, which I think is wonderful, is sleep. Think about quality of sleep, think about regularity of sleep. And, you see it all the time. Somebody who's out till 8, 9, 10, 11 o'clock at night, and then they're up for their 5 a.m. workout. And if you look at the sleep research, very few of us are in that 5.5 to 6 hour a night of sleep. That's all we need. I mean, I know. And sometimes realistically, what's going on with your life, sometimes some of these things aren't going to happen. A great example of that is I mentioned my learning that blue light had an effect on me. Started using the Oura Ring and realized that I was getting about 5.5 hours of sleep a night. And I knew that I was not going to get more sleep. This was a conscious choice because I had that epileptic dog that I mentioned, and she had a tendency to seize anywhere between about 11 o'clock at night and 4 in the morning. So anytime she or my other dog turned over in bed or turned over in their bed or rattled their collars, I was upright, fight or flight. Oh my God, is Emma having a seizure? My sleep quality sucked. Now that went on I was aware of that for the last 2 years of her life. And I knew this is not going to improve significantly until Emma dies. And I would say this 2.5 years after she's died, I wish I was still getting 5.5 hours of sleep, but I knew I knew, okay, I have to take this into account. It's not necessarily, I'm not gonna say it was a bad or a good thing because I wouldn't give up the experience of having that dog. But I do know once she died, suddenly I jumped to having anywhere between 6 hours and 50 minutes of sleep to 7 hours and 30 minutes of sleep for the same amount of time in bed. Oh, wow. So it's important to be aware of what are those things that you can control versus can't control. And I mean, it really comes down to, we've seen during COVID, people realizing, I don't want to live in a city, or, I don't like my job. All of these changes that we make. And I think the great thing about your podcast is talking about changes. They don't have to happen overnight. Mm-hmm. I tell my clients, when they start a workout program or they start something new, because I do some personal training on the side, don't look at it now. Look at it 3 months from now. What's gone well? What's not gone well? Great example. There's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to do things. Great example with somebody I interviewed for my podcast who coaches endurance athletes. He had this marathoner who did a great job on all of her workouts, was really happy, except there was this one workout that involved 2 by 20 minutes at a certain intensity. Mm-hmm. And every time he'd go over her programming and look at it, she'd never finish this workout. And so finally he just asked her, he said, what's the problem? You're fit enough. This is a workout that you should be doing well. And she said, I just can't concentrate. I wake up the night before, I'm dreading it, and I get in the middle of it and I make excuses. She goes, well, what if we did 4 by 10 minutes? Would that be better? She goes, yeah, it's that 20 minutes. So they made that one simple change, and it went back. So that's where the sounding board that I mentioned is the first thing, whether it's somebody you're paying, And this is, don't necessarily go off the certification, but go off word of mouth and gut feeling. I mean, I had the good fortune to interview a mental health professional, and he's like, one of the things is we don't give enough credence to, go with your gut. If there's somebody it's like you just don't sense that they're right for you, there's probably something there. So all of these are a long-term solution, so that you can work on health span, and credit to Don Moxley for that term, versus lifespan. Health span thinking quality of life.
It's funny that you ended with that, because that was going to be my next question. Sort of defining the difference between health span and lifespan, because we talked about it before the podcast, and the importance of people understanding the difference between the two and why you should strive for one versus striving for the other. Because a lot of people, I think, strive for an extended lifespan, but it's really health span that we need to strive for. And you've given a myriad of different tips, wearables that you can take advantage of, and as a tool to be able to measure your success, all with the overarching goal of improving health span over a lifespan. Can you tell everybody sort of the difference between the two and why we should be striving for one versus the other?
Sure. I'll start out with a little bit of story. When I taught freshman health class in college, I used to tell this story and got some really strange looks. So my parents, when they were first married, there was somebody in their church who was in her 80s. She fell and she broke her hip. And this was in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And when somebody broke their hip when they were in their 80s, what they did then is they basically said, well, we're going to put you in bed because you're not going to live that long. They didn't do hip replacements. They didn't do hip surgeries, et cetera. She lived to be well over 100 with absolutely no dementia. Long lifespan. I don't think anybody will disagree. Reaching 100 years is a lifespan. On the other hand, I told the story, or I would counter that with, because we were in Florida, in the Tampa area, there is the Pinellas Trail, which is a rails to trails for bicyclists. There was a gentleman who had done Ironman distance triathlons, got up one Labor Day to go for a bike ride on the Pinellas Trail, and in the midst of the bike ride fell off his bike and was dead when he hit the ground of a massive stroke. He was in his early 80s. So again, you could say he had a pretty long lifespan, although we all know that a significant number of people who are older than 82, 83, but his health span was much better than that first example I told. He was able to do what he wanted to do literally right up until the time he died. And now I will admit that that probably was rough on his friends and his family. Most of us, if we could say, how do you want to go? We would say we want to go doing something we enjoy doing, and we don't want to have a period of time where we're not able to do those things. So health span is being able to do things, being able to enjoy life, have a quality of life as long as possible. And we need to recognize health span is different for everybody. Some people, their idea of health span or what they enjoy doing is going to be different from what you and I enjoy. I tell people, and I'm semi-serious, I'm 53 now, so I'm on the latter half of my life probably, but I tell people, it's like, I want to live to be 104. And they look at me and they go, why do you want to live that long? It's like, because there's so many things that I want to do, so many things that I want to try. Now, will I reach 104? I don't know. I hope so. You never know with all the research. Maybe in 50 years or 51 years, maybe 104 is perfectly realistic for the majority of people. And maybe I have to readjust it, or maybe I don't live that long. But whether
could be the new 40, right?
it could be the new 40. And you and I were also chatting beforehand. What people don't realize, and again, I want to thank Don Moxley for pointing this out to me or reminding me of this. Genetics have 20 to 30% effect on our health span. What we do or do not do. And, we're talking sleep, we're talking lifestyle, we're talking diet, movement, et cetera, diet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is the remaining 70 to 80%. So I always tell my clients that I work with, it's like, look, you do these things, this personal training, the resistance training, so you can do the things you want to do. And one more story that's really had an impact on me is about 15 years ago, I had a client, very good client. He was retired from a high-level banking job, but had always been active all his life, enjoyed hiking, enjoyed skiing, and had a kidney stone. Went to the hospital when it wasn't passing, and they found out he had lung cancer. stage 4.
Wow.
No symptoms. I still remember him saying, he came to his session with me afterwards because this was something he enjoyed doing. He said, it's going to kill me. He said, I absolutely know it's going to kill me. I know this is fatal. I'm going to do as much as possible. The two things he was able to do, one of the things he'd done for 30 some years is he'd gone to either Aspen or Vail the first week in December alone to ski. He said, nobody's ever there. I can ski, etc. The year after he was diagnosed, he sent me a picture from the top of the mountain, looking down, nobody's there. He was able to do that after being diagnosed with what was essentially, as he said, a death sentence. The second thing is he had some side effects from the chemo, etc. Ended up in hospice, had a stroke. The day before he had a second stroke and passed on, his wife sent me a picture of him pushing his newly born grandson or granddaughter down the hallway using the stroller as a walker. And if you want to think about the next day, unfortunately, he had another stroke and passed. But that child now someplace has a video of grandpa showing that movement really was a lifestyle. This is somebody who literally, he would go from a chemo treatment to come in and work with me. And sometimes we just did breath work because he understood the importance of doing something that was good for him. Maybe it wasn't good for him physically, and we obviously cut back on what he did, but psychologically and outlook on life, I think, even though he struggled with it, that's somebody who just exemplified saying, I'm going to maximize my health span.
Such a powerful, two phenomenal stories that you told there that really, I think, hit home and explain the importance of the difference between lifespan and health span. And it is something that I think so many people have the tendency not to focus on, especially with today's traditional, what I'll say, pharmaceutical driven society, where it's, what can I do to mask a symptom of a problem versus addressing a problem that quite often can be addressed with the myriad of things that you just suggested: diet, exercise, sleep, finding a way to de-stress, because stress can wreak havoc on your body in the forms of these debilitating diseases that are out there today, which ultimately shorten both our lifespan and our health span. So, two last questions for you, Ben. First question: how can people find you? How can they get in contact with you? How can they collaborate with you?
And that's one of the great things about social media. As I said, it's good and bad. The easiest way to contact me, because I'm all over the internet, unfortunately or fortunately, the easiest way is if you go on Instagram and go at FITLABPGH, or you type in on Google Fitness Lab Pittsburgh. That happens to get more hits than Moving to Live simply because it's been around longer. That will take you to it. The Instagram thing, I tell people, the great thing about that is 3 times a week, we do 1-minute movement tip lifestyle hack videos. Usually they're in the woods because, like you, that's where I think, outside moving with the dogs. That's the best way to probably get in touch with us. So just Fitness Lab Pittsburgh or FitLab PGH, either on Instagram, or if you type it into Google, probably the first 2 or 3 pages are all either going to be YouTube, podcast, etc. You can message me through any of those, and I'll be able to get back to you.
I love it. Not hard to find, which is great, because we could talk for hours. There's so much knowledge that you have. I will put the information that Ben has given in the show notes, as well as his podcast, so people have an opportunity to connect with him and learn more and make movement more a part of their lives. So, Ben, last question. I always ask this question of everybody at the end. So we've been speaking for about an hour. You've gone through a variety of different things, but a lot of times stuff goes in some people's ear and out the other. If there's one thing that people can take from this podcast with them to incorporate into their lives, because you gave us a lot, that would make an immediate impact on their lives and help them change and evolve towards a better version of themselves, what's the one thing that, and maybe it's something you didn't mention, that they can incorporate into their lives to grow and to be the best version of themselves?
I'm going to be one of those people who gives a 3-part answer because I think they're all important.
Fair.
I think the first thing is probably was said to me by my dad when I was in 7th or 8th grade, when I was complaining, as middle school kids often are, or something isn't fair. It's not fair. And this was pre-internet. He pulled up the speech that John F. Kennedy once said, where life is not fair. I think that's the first thing that all of us need to recognize. Sometimes life isn't fair. That gentleman that I mentioned who was diagnosed with cancer, that wasn't fair. He had a lot to give. But life isn't fair. So, when something bad happens, absolutely give yourself time to be miserable. Every time I tore a retina, I bitched and complained and did everything. But then move on and say, what can I do to mitigate this? Or what can I do to be better? So you are a steward for yourself. And I think this is probably synopsing it. You mentioned that you were having some health problems and you were seeking out treatment methods that you were finding successful. Seek out experts, seek out people to give you information, take control. I've joked with my dad before, people spend more time looking for a mechanic for their sports car than they do looking for medical health. So you mentioned that medicine has a tendency to focus on sickness and giving people drugs. In big picture, I totally agree with you. But having worked in the medical field with orthopedic surgeons and being smart enough or fortunate enough, there are pockets of people or people who do not think that way. Seek them out. If you don't, and that's one of the things, because you are a steward, you should have a list of people that you've sought out that you can seek for advice, a list of medical professionals. Like I absolutely know, if I have an orthopedic problem, I know 2 or 3 physicians that I am comfortable contacting. I obviously have a retinal surgeon that I comfortably contact. And one of the things that's obvious when you get 1 or 2 of these people, they attract other people. The chiropractor that I mentioned that I go to, who, by the way, has never manipulated or adjusted me. It's all been exercise, specific reasons for me. He came to me as recommendations from 2 physicians I interviewed for my podcast. He's recommended other people in both the medical field and the personal field. So you are compiling. I'm going to drop another name, and people who go to the FitLab podcast will see it. There's a guy here in Pittsburgh named Larry Joya who has the theory or the axiom ABCD, always be connecting the dots. It's not who I know, it's who I know who knows somebody else. So I may not know anybody where you are, or you may not know anybody where I am, but I can probably, with 2 or 3 phone calls, find somebody to give you information you need. And I think as a closing for that, I probably would have told you 6 years ago, that's BS. I have a track of records in my podcast of 14 or 15 interviews that I can trace all the way back to Larry Joya, where he said, you need to interview this guy, you need to interview this guy. Treat your health, whether it's the medical profession, whether it's personal trainers, whether it's people in the nutrition field, the same way. If somebody's good, ask them, who do you recommend for this? And all of a sudden you'll have that cadre or that group of people that are going to give you the best chances for quality of life and best health span, as opposed to just a long lifespan.
I love it. You are a wealth of knowledge, Dr. Ben. So much information. I encourage everybody who enjoyed this to listen to his podcast. Ben, thanks again so much for your time today in schooling us on the art of motion and everything that you do. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you. As you can tell, I enjoy talking about it, and hopefully your listeners are getting one piece, because I'm always told if you get one piece out of a podcast or a presentation, it's worthwhile.
It is worthwhile. It's what it is. We can start the journey for so many. All right. Thank you, Ben. Hey, everybody. Thank you for listening to the Adapt You podcast today. Our goal with this show and all of our content is to deliver you the guests and the respective knowledge necessary to help you change something in your life. Everyone who listens to this show has something they want to affect and something they want to change. And our goal is to help give you the knowledge necessary to take you down that path on becoming the absolute best version of yourself. If you like what you heard today, please tune in to all of our shows and also check us out in social media. You can find us on Instagram, on Facebook, and check out our website and have some great content on there as well. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next show.